Hello. Thanks for listening to the 14th episode of The Bible and You. This program is focused on the study of God's holy word without the burden of any preconceived dogma or denominational doctrine. Today I will continue in a series of episodes dealing with the identification of the beast of the book of Revelation, usually called the Antichrist. In episode 13, I indicated that there was a man in history who seems to have fulfilled much of what has been written about the Antichrist. However, he's a man who, according to written historical records, has already lived and died. His name is Antiochus IV, and he is the subject of this episode. Antiochus IV is not named in the Bible, and so almost all we know about him is taken from secular history. Therefore, it seems that a disclaimer about the accuracy of what I have to say may be in order at this point. It has been well documented how inaccurate eyewitnesses often are in their recollections and descriptions of events they have observed. Just ask any police investigator. They will tell you that they usually are told as many variations of any story as they have eyewitnesses. Different people just see, recall, interpret, and recount things in different ways. Therefore, any discussion of the past should be undertaken with the understanding that all events in history are subject to the often fallible memories and distortions, intentional or not, of those who witnessed the events. And if eyewitness accounts are full of inaccuracies, and they are, the descriptions of those who were not actually there are even worse. Add to that the passage of time, and the problems are further compounded. A perfect example of an event that many of us certainly believe took place, that seems to be well documented, and to which there are a few surviving eyewitnesses, is the Holocaust of the 1930s and 40s. I certainly believe it happened, but there is a growing group of people who deny it, either in part or in whole. Some of the deniers are doing so for political reasons, but there is a substantial number of those who I think actually believe that the Holocaust never happened and the story is a complete lie. So, we can understand that there are always differing points of view about any historical event or character. This episode of The Bible and You is about secular history, and the events I want to discuss took place from about 323 BC to about 164 BC, and they were certainly long enough ago to assure that no completely accurate account actually exists. All of what I tell you is based on sources, some of which are far removed in time and geography from the actual events. Most of what I have found ultimately relies on the writings of various Greek and Roman historians and the books of the Maccabees, which are included in some Bibles but are not usually considered to be the inspired Word of God. Numerous writers have researched these same sources and come away with differing interpretations. Even in my limited research, I have discovered several discrepancies. However, just because these differences in the accounts exist, we shouldn't deny that there is some truth in what we find. In addition, the names of ancient nobility were often reused again and again to refer to different people, a fact which further adds to the confusion. It becomes a matter of using our best judgment to sift through the information and arrive at our own conclusions. If you're a regular listener to these programs, you know that I always recommend that very process. Don't take my word for it. Check it out for yourself. With that said, I want to tell you my understanding of the life and character of the man best known as Antiochus IV, and who is considered by many to be a prototype of the Antichrist that is to come. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, he left no heir apparent to his position as the ruler of much of the known world. As a result, his kingdom was divided among his most powerful generals. These generals, along with other notables of the time, became known as the Diadochi, and almost immediately began to fight over control of Alexander's empire. Many of the Diadochi were eliminated very quickly, but one of those who survived was Seleucus I. Seleucus was the son of a trusted captain of Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. Now, this captain, who was Seleucus' father, was named Antiochus, but he was not Antiochus IV. He wasn't even Antiochus I. In fact, because this Antiochus was never a king, he didn't have a number after his name, I guess that made him just plain Antiochus. Seleucus I took charge of the territory that was assigned to him, and over the course of the next 18 years or so, built it into what came to be known as the Seleucid Empire. This empire, also referred to as the Syrian Empire or the Syro-Median Empire, ultimately included much of what is modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, parts of Turkey, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Israel. It was huge. Seleucus added so much territory that he became known as Seleucus Nicator, that is, Seleucus the Conqueror. In the process, he built over a dozen large cities, one of the most well-known of which was Antioch, the city in which the Bible tells us that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. Although Antioch once approached Rome and Alexandria of Egypt in political and commercial importance, it was devastated during the Crusades and is relatively unimportant in modern times. As you probably surmise, the city of Antioch was named after Seleucus' father, Antiochus. In 305 BC, Seleucus decided he wanted the title of king, so he just took it and became Seleucus I, the first in a long and complicated list of rulers of the Seleucid Empire. I have made a chart to help you keep up with who's who and when they reigned in the Seleucid Empire. Find the link section and click on the link that says Seleucid Kings. This will open a PDF of the chart, which should make it easier for you to follow along with me as we work our way toward Antiochus IV. The life story of Seleucus I, or Seleucus Nicator, is interesting and full of intrigue, deception, and some incest. Seleucus had a son, who he named, you guessed it, Antiochus. Antiochus grew to become a young man, but his health was poor. Seleucus called for his doctor to determine the cause of the boy's poor condition, and after some time the doctor discovered that Antiochus was lovesick for his own stepmother. The doctor didn't quite know how to break the news to Seleucus, but he ultimately thought of a clever plan to disclose this information. He told Seleucus that Antiochus was in love with his wife, that is, the doctor's wife. Seleucus immediately demanded that the doctor give over his wife to Antiochus to cure him of his sickness, but the doctor refused. He asked Seleucus if he would be willing to give up his own wife to Antiochus, to which Seleucus immediately replied that of course he would. Then the doctor revealed the truth to Seleucus, who had no choice but to surrender his own wife to his son Antiochus. Now this Antiochus became king of the empire in 281 BC, and thus he was called Antiochus I. He was followed by his son, Antiochus II, in 261 BC, who was murdered by his wife and succeeded by his son, Seleucus II, in 246 BC. While there are some interesting stories surrounding each of these rulers and their wars and adventures, for the sake of time I won't cover them here. Suffice it to say that the reign of each of them, and most of their successors, was full of immorality. But now let's move forward to the next in line, Antiochus III, the son of Seleucus II. Antiochus III took the throne in 222 BC as a teenager, succeeding his older brother Seleucus III. His reign began in turmoil and was marked by great successes and by great failures. Early on, Antiochus III was controlled by a man named Hermias, who had been an advisor to Seleucus II. But Hermias was more interested in his own successes than those of Antiochus or even the empire itself. His advice to Antiochus III led to many conflicts and difficulties for the young king. However, Antiochus III was himself rather ambitious and could be quite self-centered. After one successful campaign, he briefly assumed the title of Antiochus the Great, which seemed to stick to him in history, but he actually later abandoned that epithet. Overall, Antiochus III was the most powerful of the Seleucid rulers since the founder of the empire, Seleucus I. But his end was sad indeed. Brought about in part by the distraction of a middle-aged marriage, Antiochus III suffered a series of defeats at the hands of the Romans and fell into despair. These defeats came about despite an alliance with Hannibal, one of the greatest military leaders of all times. Antiochus is quoted as saying, "Heaven persists to persecute me, and everything seems to announce my speedy ruin." Ultimately, Antiochus III was forced to accept a treaty with the Romans which left him and the Seleucid Empire in a very weak state. The 19th century American historian Dr. David Ramsay may have described it best as he wrote the following: "The unfortunate Antiochus was obliged to subscribe to a treaty the most humiliating perhaps ever dictated to a great power. The Romans required, besides a renunciation of his rights, that he should deliver up his elephants, his galleys, and vessels of every kind, together with 10 proscribed persons, among whom was Hannibal, 20 hostages between the age of 18 and 45, at the option of the Romans, among that number his own son, 540,000 bushels of wheat, and 15,000 talents, to be paid in equal parts for 12 years as tribute, but 2,500 down for the expenses of the war. They limited also his navigation and the number of his troops, as well as his alliances and connection with his neighbors. Antiochus submitted to all these conditions, suffered his ships to be burnt, and assisted at the sacrifice which was to ratify the treaty. In consequence of this ceremony, each of the contracting parties struck the victim and said, 'If I violate my engagements, may Jupiter strike me as I strike this victim.' After this period, Antiochus wandered about in his kingdom, going from town to town. In that situation, he was put to death either by his own officers or by the hands of the people, who were irritated to see the treasures of their temples carried away to pay the Romans. The end of Antiochus the Great was like that of those rivers which, after flowing for some time with a majestic course, hide themselves ignominiously in the sand." That's the end of the quote from David Ramsay. Antiochus the Great may have had as many as 8 children, all with his first wife, Laodice III, who was also his first cousin. One of his sons, probably the youngest, was named Mithridates, and it was he who was sent to Rome as a hostage to help ensure that Rome would continue to receive the ransom payments agreed to by his father. At the death of Antiochus III, the throne was assumed by his son, Seleucus IV. Seleucus IV apparently wanted the return of his brother from Rome to Antioch, and so he sent his own son, Demetrius, to Rome to be held in hostage in place of his brother, Mithridates. Now, it is important to realize that being held hostage in Rome was not as bad as it sounds. In fact, as long as the payments to Rome were paid, Mithridates and Demetrius were well treated and essentially given the luxurious lifestyle they would have received as princes in their own country. King Seleucus IV was not a happy king, because he was forced to spend most of his energy collecting taxes in order to pay the annual ransom payments due to Rome. Perhaps this is at least a part of the reason that he arranged for the return of Mithridates to Antioch. However, before Mithridates arrived, Seleucus IV was poisoned by his treasurer Heliodorus, who wanted to usurp the throne. He placed a very young son of Seleucus IV on the throne, but it was actually Heliodorus who controlled the power. He might have succeeded except for the arrival of Mithridates with an army furnished by the king of Pergamus. Mithridates took control of the empire by appointing himself co-regent with the young son of Seleucus IV, even though the rightful heir to the throne was Demetrius, who was still in Rome, and the elder son of Seleucus IV. Soon thereafter, Mithridates murdered the child and renamed himself Antiochus. So finally, we have arrived at the beginning of our main topic for this episode of The Bible and You, Antiochus IV. The man called Antiochus IV was born to Antiochus the Great and Laodice III about 215 B.C., and he took the throne of the Seleucid Empire in 175 B.C. at the approximate age of 40. Except that he lived as a hostage in Rome, little is known about him during that time, but he soon began to make an impact in Antioch. Antiochus IV was a curious blend of the outrageous and the cunning, the appealing and the disgusting. While king, he enjoyed taking to the streets and mixing with every level of society. He especially liked to hang out at the shops of metalsmiths and engravers and fancied himself an expert in their trades. Perhaps he had studied it in Rome. No person was too low in society to attract the attention of the king. He reveled with the dregs and engaged in behavior that was demeaning to his regal position. At times he would dress like a Roman and go from door to door, pretending to be soliciting votes for some office, shaking hands and embracing one and all. On other occasions he would pretend to be a judge, listen to grievances, and administer his particular brand of justice on the spot. He often drank to excess, and when he became drunk he would sometimes throw coins and sometimes throw rocks about with abandon to be collected or dodged by his fellow street dwellers. He could be generous at times and equally cruel in the blink of an eye. In short order, his critics changed the suffix of his name from the one of his choosing, that is, Epiphanes, meaning God among us, to Epimanes, meaning senseless or madman. In Jerusalem, which was contained within the Seleucid Empire and thus under the control of Antiochus IV, the position of Jewish high priest was held by Onias III. Onias was not a supporter of the Greeks and had previously come into conflict with Heliodorus by preventing him from looting the temple, so he was not in good stead with anyone in the Seleucid hierarchy. Antiochus, who had no particular love for the Jews and was more interested in money than religion, was therefore receptive when Jason, the brother of Onias III, wanted to buy the position of high priest. Jason proved to be completely corrupt and contributed greatly to the mistreatment of the Jewish people. However, it should be noted that a great many of the residents of Palestine, including some of the priesthood, were receptive to the Greek way of life and customs. Many concealed or even attempted to reverse, for example, their circumcision in order to exercise in the nude at the new Greek gymnasiums. They were pleased to be called Antiochenes. The Hellenization of the Jews, that is, the changing them to the Greek way of life, was underway. At this point in history, the battles over the control of Alexander the Great's kingdom had essentially come down to only two factions: the Seleucid Empire under the control of Antiochus IV, and the Ptolemaic Empire headed up by Ptolemy, who also called himself Epiphanes, which, as you recall, means God among us or God with us. As you can see, there was no shortage of ego among the rulers of the day. Come to think of it, there's no shortage of ego in the rulers of these modern days either. The disagreement between Antiochus and Ptolemy was heated up at the death of Cleopatra I, who, by the way, was the sister of Antiochus IV while she was the widow of Ptolemy Epiphanes. Now, if that seems strange to you, remember that essentially all of the heirs to Alexander's empire were from Macedonia. Even though Antiochus was considered a Syrian, he was in fact descended from Seleucus I, who was a Macedonian. And likewise, Ptolemy Epiphanes lived in Alexandria and ruled Greater Egypt, but he was descended from Ptolemy I, another of Alexander's generals, and likewise a Macedonian. In fact, the marriage between Cleopatra I, a Seleucid Macedonian, and Ptolemy Epiphanes, a Ptolemaic Macedonian, was an effort to put an end to fighting between these empires. Unfortunately, the result was not as they planned. After Ptolemy Epiphanes and Cleopatra I both died, control of the Ptolemaic Empire was seized by a pair of usurpers that had no regard for Antiochus IV, and they immediately demanded that certain territory be handed over to their control. Antiochus, of course, refused, and a standoff ensued. About that time, the son of Ptolemy Epiphanes and Cleopatra I, whose name was Ptolemy Philometor, turned 15 years old and was declared to be of age to rule the Ptolemaic Empire. Antiochus IV sent an ambassador to the coronation, supposedly because Ptolemy Philometor was his sister's son, and therefore his nephew, but the real mission of the ambassadors was espionage. The ambassadors reported back to Antiochus that Egypt was preparing to make war against him, and so he began similar preparations. Antiochus IV was also forced to continue in his efforts to appease Rome. Under continuous pressure to send tribute, he tried to substitute flattery for treasure, but the Romans were not fooled. Antiochus' need for money made it easy for Menelaus, another brother of the Jewish high priest, to raise the ante and persuade Antiochus to name him as the high priest in place of Jason. Menelaus proved to be the worst of the lot and greatly increased the dissatisfaction of the Jewish people with Antiochus and his rule. For the most part, Antiochus was primarily concerned with Egypt and ignored the Jews. During his first invasion of Egypt, Antiochus conquered all but the capital city of Alexandria and ravaged the country of much of its treasure. To appease Rome, which supported Egypt, Antiochus allowed a puppet king to remain in place. But 2 years later, Antiochus invaded Egypt again. This time, Rome sent an entourage to intervene before Antiochus could reach Alexandria. The Romans were led by Popilius Lenus, a man whom Antiochus knew well from the time he lived in Rome as a hostage. Antiochus approached Popilius as an old friend and offered an embrace, but he was rejected. Instead, Popilius ordered him to immediately stop the advance toward Alexandria, and when Antiochus said he would give an answer later, Popilius drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and ordered him to give an answer before he left the circle. Antiochus, for once, was stunned and agreed to break off the attack, at which time Popilius then greeted him warmly. That event, of course, is the source of the idea of drawing a line in the sand to indicate an ultimatum. Meanwhile, word mistakenly got back to the Jews that Antiochus had been killed, and Jason, the deposed high priest, gathered an army, attacked Jerusalem, and sent Menelaus packing. When Antiochus returned from Egypt in 169 BC, he believed this was a general insurrection of the Jews, and took out his frustrations with being confounded by the Romans in Egypt on the Jews. His forces butchered 80,000 Jewish men, took 40,000 more as prisoners, and sold an additional 40,000 into slavery. But not yet satisfied, he followed the corrupt priest Menelaus into the temple, polluted the Holy of Holies with his very presence, and stole everything of value. He plundered the city of Jerusalem and took the spoils back to Antioch after restoring Menelaus to his office and naming equally evil men to be the governors of Samaria and Palestine. The Hellenization of the Jews was intensified by a series of indignities and calamities intended to force the Jews to abandon the religion of their fathers as well as their culture. Antiochus was far from finished with the Jews, however. After again being stymied by the Romans in his attempts to conquer Egypt, he returned to Antioch. He sent a trusted lieutenant named Apollonius with an army of 22,000 men to Jerusalem with orders to destroy the city. Cleverly, Apollonius waited until the Sabbath day to let his intentions be known, in the correct belief that the most devout of the Jews would not fight back on the Sabbath. At the hour when they were engaged in Sabbath services, he commanded his troops to kill all the men and seize all the women and children to be sold into slavery. The troops followed their orders to the letter, and after the killing was over, they stole all the valuables that were movable and destroyed the rest. They tore down the walls of the city, built a fortress on a hilltop, and proceeded to enforce the decrees of Antiochus IV. They stopped the daily sacrifices and prohibited the worship of God Almighty in any public way. Antiochus then commanded that every nation was to lay aside its religion and take up the religion of the king, his religion, a decree that was clearly aimed at the Jews. He sent intendants into every city to enforce this decree and to preach the practices of Greek idolatry. The intendant sent to Jerusalem was proficient at stopping all Jewish religious activities, and he erected idolatrous temples and statues throughout the city. The climax of the desecrations came in 167 BC, when Antiochus erected a statue of Zeus that looked amazingly like himself in the temple and had pigs sacrificed to Zeus in the Jewish temple. Spilling the blood of swine, the epitome of unclean animals, on the altar, and so desecrating the temple was the ultimate blasphemy that Antiochus could perpetrate. But there was more. Jews were forced to eat the meat of unclean animals. Men and boys were skinned and cooked alive for not renouncing the true God. Mothers were murdered for allowing their children to be circumcised, and the children were hung. Copies of the Torah were desecrated and destroyed. The most devout believers received the most demeaning treatment. Nothing was too terrible to be used against the Jews, and Antiochus IV Epiphanes was the force behind it all. History records this as his attempts to Hellenize the Jews, but it is my opinion that he actually wanted to exterminate them, an idea that was repeated in Germany in the 1940s and is still espoused by some leaders in the Mideast. As many of you know, the Jewish response to the actions of Antiochus IV was led by Judas Maccabeus, who raised an army and rebelled. However, Antiochus IV didn't do battle directly with the Maccabees. Instead, he sent a contingent under the command of a lieutenant named Lysias. The Maccabees ultimately defeated Lysias and regained control of Jerusalem, where they cleansed the temple and reinstated Jewish religious practices. The story of this Maccabean revolt is extremely interesting and well worth knowing, but I just don't have the time to go into it here. Instead, I need to tell you about the end of Antiochus IV. The riches of Antiochus IV had grown despite the large amounts he was compelled to send to Rome. He had plundered Egypt, taken large sums from his friends, and robbed every temple within his reach. Unfortunately for him, his expenditures on extravagant Greek games and other excesses exceeded even his ability to beg, borrow, and steal. Ultimately, Antiochus was forced into yet another military campaign. After having sent half his forces with Lysias to Judea, Antiochus took the remainder to Persia to regain control of that territory and its vast riches. En route, he defeated the Armenians with ease and arrived in Persia intent on plundering there as he had done in Egypt and Judea. Much to the disappointment of Antiochus, the Persians united and defeated his army soundly, forcing him to turn tail and run. Adding insult to injury, Antiochus learned of the defeat of some of his forces in Judea, news which sent him into a rage unlike any other. He vowed that he would return there and eliminate the Jews forever, and he turned his army to the southwest. Along the way, he was met with even more bad news about the defeat of Lysias by a ragtag group of Jews under the command of Judas Maccabeus. This was the last straw for Antiochus, and he commanded his charioteers to drive toward Jerusalem with all possible speed. And he swore that he would make Jerusalem the grave of the entire Jewish nation. Not one would be left alive. The oath was still on his lips when he was struck with horrible pains in his intestines, but still he would not stop. The French historian Charles Rollin described the final hours of Antiochus IV in some detail. What follows is a lightly edited version of Rollin's description. But still Antiochus' pride was not abated by this first shock. So far from it that, suffering himself to be hurried away by the wild transports of his fury, and breathing nothing but vengeance against the Jews, he gave orders for proceeding with all possible speed in the journey. But as his horses were running forwards impetuously, the king fell from his chariot, and thereby bruised in a grievous manner every part of his body, so that he suffered inexpressible torments. Worms crawled from every part of him. His flesh fell away piecemeal, and the stench was so great that it became intolerable to the whole army. Being himself unable to bear it, Antiochus said, "It is meet to be subject unto God, and man who is mortal should not think of himself as if he were a god." This from the man who called himself Epiphanes. Thus acknowledging that it was the hand of God that struck him, because of the calamities he had brought upon Jerusalem, he promises to exert the utmost liberality toward God's chosen people, to enrich with precious gifts the holy temple of Jerusalem, which he had plundered, to furnish from his revenues the sums necessary for defraying the expense of the sacrifices, to turn Jew himself, and to travel into every part of the world in order to publish the power of the Almighty. The king hoped he should calm God's wrath by these mighty promises, which the violence of his present affliction and the fear of future torments extorted from his mouth, but not from his heart. But the Lord would no more have mercy on him. And indeed this murderer and blasphemer, being struck in a dreadful manner and treated as he had treated others, finished an impious life by a miserable death. But before Antiochus expired, he sent for Philip, who had been brought up with him from his infancy and was his favorite, and bestowed on him the regency of Syria during the minority of his son Antiochus V, who was then 9 years of age. He put into Philip's hands the diadem, the seal of the empire, and all of the other ensigns of royalty, exhorting him especially to employ his utmost endeavors to give the young king such an education as would best teach him the art of reigning, and of governing his subjects with justice and moderation. Few princes give such instructions to their children till they are near their end, and only after having set them quite a different example during their whole lives. Philip caused the king's body to be conveyed to Antioch. Antiochus IV had reigned 11 years. That is the end of the edited passage from Charles Rollin, and if we stopped there it would seem to be the end of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. But there is a mysterious epilogue to this story. A little-known Roman historian of the 2nd century A.D. wrote that, and I quote, "Antiochus died of terror one night. While his body was being carried back to Antioch, the animals suddenly took fright, and his body was tossed into the river and disappeared. This was the penalty he paid for his flagrant sacrilege." That's the end of the quote. This was written by Granius Licinianus, and not much of his work survives. However, what does remain is full of anecdotes and personal revelations that often do not appear elsewhere. In some ways, he seems to have been more of a gossip than a historian. I've included this story about Antiochus IV because I find it curious and yet somehow fitting, considering the often perplexing life that Antiochus lived. At any rate, history tells us that Antiochus IV was the last really powerful of the Seleucid kings. Although there were many more kings that came after him, the empire was in a seemingly irreversible decline. It is widely accepted to have ended in 64 B.C. But I don't think we've heard the last of it, or of Antiochus IV. In the next episode, we will return to Daniel's prophecies and continue trying to unravel the identity of the coming Antichrist. Until then, thanks for listening to The Bible and You. May God bless you and keep you in His will. And don't forget to study your Bible, to pray, and to reach your own conclusions. Don't take my word for anything.